right, hello everyone. My name is Claire Patton, and welcome to Discovering Digital Humanities with the Oklahoma State University Library. Today, I'm interviewing Dr. Lisa Hollenbach about a class that she taught recently. Hi, Dr. Hollenbach.
Hi, Claire. So I'm going to talk a little bit about a collaborative student project that I do in an upper level English class that I teach called Listening to Contemporary Poetry. So this is a class that is about the ways that poets have engaged with audio media, specifically poets after 1950, in kind of innovative ways. So I knew when I was teaching this class that I really wanted students to kind of make their own creative audio project. And so I designed this audio podcast project to help students find kind of different ways of engaging with poetry. I've taught this class 2 times before, in 2018, and then most recently last spring in 2020. And both times students have produced fantastic projects. So I'm actually going to start by playing a little clip, a little intro from the student podcast series that my students made in spring 2020. So students design all parts of this project. They're in groups, and they, in their groups, develop their own episodes, but we also all use the same intro. And that intro is also student designed. So I'm going to play this intro from last spring.
You're tuned into the Listening to Contemporary Poetry series, a podcast created by students in collaboration with the Oklahoma State University English Department.
It's all artists, but the artist is trying to say something.
I'm still writing blues on the radio. Those physical, emotional, psychic expressions of what is deepest and strongest and richest within each one of us.
All I put my mind is your machinery.
So this is, like I said, part of a class that I teach called Listening to Contemporary Poetry. And this slide just shows you a kind of flyer for the class and the first page of my syllabus. And it's a class, like I said, that's really focused on poetry and performance, how poets use new media, and really tries to think about listening as a really important way that we engage with contemporary poetry. So not only reading it on the page, but also listening to it. And in this class, like I said, I was really inspired to do an audio project with students, partly because there are so many great poetry audio podcasts out there right now. So on this slide, I just highlighted a few of my favorites. One of my favorite poetry podcasts out there is a poetry podcast called Poem Talk, where some scholars just get together, some readers get together and just talk about a poem that they like and kind of work through their own responses to it. But there are so many great poetry podcasts out there. So my students and I listen to these poetry podcasts kind of during the semester, and then they make their own. And there are sort of several stages to this audio project because, you know, most of students in the English department, most of our English majors don't have like a background experience in creating digital projects or audio projects. So we do kind of it in stages. They learn some basic skills of audio production, digital audio production. And then we also go through a kind of number of planning stages, including making storyboards. They do a proposal or a pitch for the episode topic they want to do. They write a whole plan for their project, and then they do a kind of audio draft that then gets revised and edited. So it's really a semester-long cumulative project that students work together in groups of 3 or 4 to create these episodes on really any topic that they want that's related to contemporary poetry. And they can bring in other media or music or audio also into their projects. The episodes themselves are quite short. They're about 10 minutes long, which I think is a good length for, you know, creating kind of a quick, engaging podcast that also is kind of doable with limited training. This slide shows you a kind of screenshot of the homepage. So in the times I've taught this project, we've used just SoundCloud as a hosting service, a platform to share our podcasts with each other. In the future, I really hope to kind of develop a more dynamic interface for presenting these podcasts, but SoundCloud has worked okay for us in kind of as a platform for their work. This is our page from 2020, and you can see here that we have a number of different episodes. We had 6 episodes that semester. On this one, you'll see highlighted the poet Audre Lorde. So one of our groups did their presentation, their podcast about Audre Lorde. Other episodes that students did, took up another number of different subjects. So lots of podcasts on individual poets. So people did podcasts on poets like our recent Nobel winner Louise Glick, former US poet laureate Juan Felipe Herrera, Audre Lorde, who you see here, Sonia Sanchez, Allen Ginsberg, Sylvia Plath, lots of different poets from the sort of late 20th century. Students also approached this project with different formats. So some did like a discussion style format, sort of unscripted, more discussion oriented. Others did more scripted, kind of documentary style. And I even had one group that did like a creative montage and sort of audio montage of sound, which was a really awesome project.
All right, thank you for sharing with us about that. That sounded really interesting. And one thing that I noticed as I was going through and listening to them, that a lot of the students went over their expected time limit, and that signaled to me that they really enjoyed this project.
Yeah, I think, it's a great experience because at the start, I think, students often kind of feel nervous. It's really new for them. It's a new technology. Collaborative projects can be daunting. So often at the beginning, I think people are kind of hesitant on the buy-in, but it's such a rich experience over the course of the semester. They really bond as a group, and then the work they produce, I think is really high quality for, just one semester kind of engaging with these projects. And they get really excited about their readings of the poems, their research that they're doing. So personally, I think it's been a great experience.
Absolutely. So my first question to you is, how do you define digital humanities?
Great question. And I don't know that I have like a definition of digital humanities. I don't usually consider myself a digital humanities scholar because in my own research, which is very much tied to the subject matter of this class, my own research is focused on how 20th century poets have engaged with sound media. And specifically, I'm working on a book project right now about how poets have interacted with independent and public radio kind of post 1945 in the 1960s and 70s. So my research involves a lot of archival work, certainly involves a lot of media studies and media work listening, but I don't really have a digital part to my scholarly project. So my entry into DH has been through teaching, and I've really felt like I've learned a lot from other digital humanities scholars who use digital projects in their classes in various ways. So I guess as a definition of digital humanities, it seems like it can be very broad, right?
Yeah.
And to be connected actually to my entryway is through the way that poets and writers have always engaged with new media, including digital media, to kind of expand the audiences for their work. And so I think the humanities has a lot of potential to kind of shape those technologies and use them in really innovative ways.
Absolutely. I know that many humanities scholars who don't have a background in computer science struggle to define themselves as digital humanities scholars. How did they feel about working with technology for this project, especially as it's an upper level English course?
Yeah, like I said, I think some students are hesitant at first, although some are very excited from the beginning. I think there's a lot of diversity of responses. It's true that when you're an upper level English major, you don't maybe in your coursework do a lot of like multimedia projects, but also you get sick of writing papers.
Yeah.
So it's like, in a way, you're using a lot of the same skills. And, my students were doing close literary analysis, they were doing research, they were doing argumentation, they were even doing like storyboarding and narrative. Actually, there was a lot of writing as part of this project. But in the end, they produced this kind of, more multimedia, audio project that was something different that I think a lot of them were really excited about. And then I had other students who had a background in audio production or who were musicians who were really excited to get to use some of the skills that they already had and bring them into the class. And I personally, not having a background in those skills, really looked to those students, was really like learning with those students how to make this project work.
Yeah, that sounds like a lot of fun. So how does listening tie into DH? I know that was a big theme in your course.
Yeah, like I said, that's kind of my entry into digital humanities. And I think it's a really important part of the digital humanities that sometimes gets forgotten. I think sometimes when we think about the digital humanities, We'll think about like websites. So we'll think a lot about the visual kind of aspects of digital humanities. We might think about video production, but like the audio side, I think sometimes is kind of neglected or lost. And yet there's so much exciting work being done right now in podcasting. So there's really a good entry there for podcast projects, for humanists and humanist scholars to find ways to present their work through these new mediums. But also for me, my own research has really made a lot of use of digital audio archives. And I think, that's a kind of another side that, the audio can add to the digital humanities, is that, there are more and more kind of resources in the digital realm for doing audio research that just wouldn't have been possible. I mean, when I was an undergraduate, even, I wouldn't have been able to study all these poetry recordings unless I was sort of collecting them myself. So yeah, exciting.
Do you think listening mediums of DH help share information with the general public?
I think it can. And I think there are some exciting podcasts out there that are doing that. And some of the poetry podcasts that I mentioned earlier, I think do a really excellent job of bringing poetry to listeners, which is, poetry is an oral art as well as a written art. And those podcasts, I think, help really make that connection. And I think more and more readers of poetry expect that. They want to hear the poet reading their work. That's an important way that contemporary readers engage with poetry. So I think it definitely has that potential for scholars and kind of to bridge that public academic divide. But I'm also interested in the ways that scholars can also learn from what they're finding out and bring that also into their scholarship. So, how can, in my own research, I think a lot about how can listening itself be a methodology for scholarship, and where can we kind of look outside of the sort of traditional models of reading that we find in literary critical history. Where else can we look to see kind of new models of sort of listening as a methodology, if that makes sense?
Yeah. So can you explain some of your thought process behind and how listening as a methodology plays out in your research?
So it's, I guess in multiple ways. One way is that I think a lot about the ways that poets themselves listen. So, as a literary scholar, I'm really interested in poetry as an oral art form, but I'm also interested in poetry as an aural art form, AURAL. In other words, as an art form that also records and sort of reflects the ways that poets experience a multimedia and sonic world. And so poets themselves are listeners, and how do they attune to kind of specific kind of aspects of media history or kind of soundscapes that they're engaged in. And I think poetry offers often a kind of innovative way of listening. So what I would suggest in my research is that there's not sort of just one, listening isn't just kind of a universal, one kind of dimensional experience, right? There are multiple practices that we bring to listening, and that includes the way we listen to literature.
Do you think the increase in the availability of listening mediums and the desire to hear a poet's voice reading their own work, do you think that's going to change how poetry and books are written?
Well, I think it already has, and I think it will continue to. I mean, one of the things that I find in my research is that this is really an ongoing story of the relationship between literature and sound media since the 19th century, actually, and definitely in the 20th century. And so the emergence, for example, of the spoken word record in the 1950s, where you have this big LP record with a poet reading their work, that becomes a new recording genre after World War II, and poets start kind of, preparing their work for that context. But then that also informs kind of, right, how poets are also writing and thinking about, the oral dimensions of their work. Or the tape recorder, for example, the invention of the tape recorder had a huge impact on the ways that poets kind of thought about the audio dimensions of their work and, use the tape recorder as a compositional tool, as a tool for disseminating their sort of oral work. So this is a long history, and I think we are continuing to find kind of writers engaging with in new ways with the new media possibilities. And certainly there are so many options now for poets to share performance, whether that's through audio media, digital audio media, or audiovisual media, YouTube platforms, Instagram. We all know the ways that poetry is getting shared on social media platforms these days. often in multimedia forms.
Yeah.
And so we can think about the impact on literature there, how are poets responding to this is interesting.
Yeah. Well, is there anything else that you would like to add as we end our time together today?
Well, I'll just say, as I mentioned before, I mean, the library has been a great resource for me in developing these projects. And so, I do wish that and kind of hope that more of my colleagues would, take advantage of those opportunities, because I think another thing it's encouraged me to do doing this project is to think more collaboratively about my own teaching and research. And often, at least in my field, you can feel kind of solitary in your research or your teaching, but as soon as you do a digital project, like, you have to collaborate. And so that's been an exciting part of it for me too.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for this interview today.